Okay.
Are you?
Well, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the University of Sydney and the very first United States Study Centre event for 2025. I'm Hayley Channer. I'm the Director of the Economic Security Program at USSC, and it's so great to see so many people interested in geopolitics right after Australia Day. It looks like everyone's ready to get back into it. Before we get going, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney is located, and also the US Study Centre. Tonight's all about geopolitics, and First Nations people are no strangers to geopolitics. Indigenous Australians were this country's first traders, this country's first diplomats, and of course, they had their fair share of conflict and warfare. So if this country's known geopolitics for at least the last 60,000 years, are we getting any better at it? I think the answer to that is no. I'd also like to introduce the other speaker tonight, the CEO of the US Studies Centre, Dr. Michael Green. Dr. Green comes from one of the preeminent think tanks in the world, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, DC. He is also a fully tenured professor at Georgetown University. And from 2001 to 2005, he provided advice to the US president as part of the National Security Council at the White House. So Dr. Green brings huge experience to this role, and it's going to be a fantastic conversation tonight. Before we get going, I also wanted to acknowledge something that had happened just a few hours ago. It's an evolving situation, but very unfortunately, an American Airlines passenger plane and a Black Hawk helicopter collided right near Reagan International Airport in Washington, DC, and some people have fallen into the Potomac underneath. Obviously, the event tonight is not about that, but it would be remiss of me not to say a remark on it as a tragedy for all Americans and for everybody here in Australia. So hopefully people are okay, and we'll see what happens. So the United States Study Centre, what we do here is we don't react to big news stories that are a flash in the pan. We like to provide our audience with more depth and understanding of the longer term trends that are happening, because I can guarantee you over the next 4 years, there are going to be a lot of big headlines. So in the first month of this year alone, some of those big attention grabbing headlines have been Donald Trump looking at Canada as the 51st state, Greenland as the 52nd state, a canal and a gulf, all to America. But I think what we need to be mindful of is those big overarching trends that are going to have longevity, to not get that fatigue, the attention fatigue about what will happen over the next 4 years, and to think about what are the actual realities of what will change for Australians over the next 4 years. So Mike and I had a talk before the event tonight because we wanted to decide between the two of us what are the big geopolitical trends that Australia should be looking at, especially when the media is flooded with so much information these days. So we came up with five. We came up with 5 geopolitical trends that Australia should watch. The first one is global economic fragmentation. The second one is intensifying great power strategic competition. Number 3 is disruptive new technologies. Number 4 is challenges to social cohesion. And number 5 is an interesting one, rogues, disruptors, and spoilers. So the two of us are going to go through those 5 key themes in a little more depth for the next 30 minutes. And then for the remaining 25 minutes or so, we would love to hear from you, the audience, your questions, but also tell us if you think we missed a key theme that actually should replace or bump one of those 5 key themes off. Okay, so first let's start with global economic fragmentation. Mike, you and I have been doing a lot of work on global economic fragmentation as part of a geopolitics sprint we do with a business school. Global economic fragmentation, it's a fancy word for things aren't going as we planned in the trade world, isn't it?
It is. And thanks for the comments earlier about the accident in Washington. DC is my hometown. And actually, almost to the day, 40 years ago, there was an accident at the same airport. And I was a student. I remember really well being in my dad's Toyota Celica listening to the news. So it's a shocker, and appreciate your comments, and appreciate everybody coming. Hayley and I have had a lot of fun producing this sprint course, this executive course for the business school. Also doing a lot of work with corporations and government on economic security. We had a major conference in June last year where we had 5 secretaries of departments from Canberra come up to Sydney, and CEOs from multinationals, trying to make sense of this new world, which, if you are in the corporate boardroom, doesn't make sense. I mean, if you're interested in business, it's about maximizing profits and efficiencies and providing wealth to shareholders and all the rest. But a lot of decisions being made in Beijing, Washington, and Canberra are not being made with an aim to maximizing productivity and profit or prosperity. It's about national security and protecting the state and the people from threats that are perceived, where economics are a key variable. And it was interesting when we did our conference in June, because my impression was this new world where geopolitics is really forcing hard decisions by corporations. It's pretty new for Australia, actually, in part because Australia's manufacturing sector is not as big or as significant as it would be for US, Japan, Korea, Germany. So as an American, we've been debating this for a long time. And Italians and Germans and Japanese would too, because the manufacturing sector is being directly hit by so many challenges. And also the national security dimension is fairly new for many Australians. I think the government has been well aware of it. What was encouraging about the conference was 5 secretaries, Treasury, DFAT, Defense, DICER, all getting together, all agreeing on not identical viewpoints, but on a cohesive strategy for Australia. So in some ways, the Financial Times Santa correspondent who wrote Australia is going to be a pathfinder for how we navigate this new era of geopolitics and business, where the two don't always work together. What happened? It's not going away. It is going to be an accelerating trend. The fragmentation of markets, supply chains moving out of China, export control, technology controls. The US, during and after World War II, led in creating the Bretton Woods system, a system of open economic growth, because in the 1930s, we all realized that protectionism and trading blocs had exacerbated conflict, created more militarism in Japan, were part of National Socialism in Germany. America was partly to blame. The British Empire was partly to blame for these trading blocs. And so the US really pushed hardest after the war. Very tough discussions with Australian governments and British governments about ending imperial preferences, opening markets. And, you know, honestly, it was a good thing to do, and it was good for American business and farmers because we were opening new markets. So it was easy to sell politically. That got harder as Japan rose and Germany rose and American car companies started facing competition. But every trade agreement in the US passed in the US Congress until Donald Trump pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Joe Biden continued that same allergy about free trade agreements, which might make it look like, well, the Americans helped create this world of open international trade, and now they're ruining it. But
that's not the whole story.
That's not the whole story. It's not even most of the story. A lot of other things are happening. A lot of it is China. I mean, China's accession to the WTO was an important thing for the world, and especially for Australia in the 90s and 2000s. But China did not honor its obligations on the WTO. And in the 2000s and 2010s, and you hear this a lot more in America or Japan or Korea than in Australia, rampant intellectual property rights theft. And of course, Australia experienced embargoes, WTO violating economic embargoes. And increasingly in recent years, China has struggled economically and is exporting its overcapacity. It's trying to grow out by exporting, which is why you have tariffs on EVs in the US and Europe because of dumping. Some of it's endogenous, globalization. There's pushback against globalization. The gap between rich and poor has grown. Productivity in the US is super high, but so is the gap between who's benefiting and who's not. So there's some things about global economics that have been challenges, but this is a trend for sure. And I think, well, in our sprint, we noted that in surveys, corporate leaders now identify geopolitics as one of the things they most worry about in their business, and it's not going away. It may not be as bad as we think. In our surveys at USSC, surveys I did at CSIS, when you ask Americans, Japanese, Australians, Brits, Germans about decoupling from China, you never get 20% who think that we should cease economic activity. US trade with China, despite US and China being at the epicenter of this decoupling and de-risking and fragmentation, US trade with China right now is larger than Australia, Japan, and Korea's trade with China combined. And even higher tariffs, which I'm sure you want to say something about. US average tariff rate now is the lowest in the G7, except for Japan. And so some caveats to put it in perspective, but there's no doubt that national security and politically driven reordering of supply chains, industrial policy, all the rest is going to accelerate in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great overview from the war to now. How do we get to now? And I think for Australians, we've really benefited from a free trading system, and that really started to come into question in 2018 when we faced economic coercion from China. But other countries have been on a different pathway, an earlier pathway. So for instance, in Japan in 2010, there was a political conflict between China and Japan is completely reliant on rare earths for a lot of its different energy needs. And China decided to halt rare earth supplies to Japan in 2010. So even though in Australia we felt this from about 2018 onwards, other countries, the United States as well, has been feeling the negative implications of free trade, because some countries that have an oversupply or a dominance in particular industries can weaponize that particular trading good. And so while we have really felt the benefits of globalization and free trade, other countries in the world have been seeing that there's some chinks in the armor. There's only two other things I'll mention about global economic fragmentation before we move on to the second one, which is big power strategic competition. The two things I want to talk about are industrial policy and shifting supply chains. So there has been a huge increase in the number of industrial policies that countries around the world have been implementing. So back in 2017, there were just over 200 industrial policies. In 2023, there was 2,500 industrial policies. Why are countries implementing industrial policy? Look, there's many, many reasons. I think one of the main ones is because they want to diversify their risk from having a main trading partner like China, or any country for that matter, controlling their main supply. So one reason they would do it would be to de-risk from a primary trading partner. Another reason that they're doing it is because of a market failure. So in Australia, for example, we're trying to invest in the clean energy revolution because the market is not doing that by itself. So that's why the Australian government has implemented Future Made in Australia, which is all about solar panels, batteries, and other technologies to actually correct a market failure. So industrial policy is on the rise, and people should be mindful there'll be more government intervention in Australia and elsewhere, which is not something that we like to do, because remember, Australia's car manufacturing didn't go so well in the 80s, and we have a sort of knee-jerk reaction against doing that again because a lot of money was wasted on car manufacturing. The second thing is supply chains. There are some really interesting supply chains that are moving away from China, or just generally diversifying. There's three companies I'll talk about: Apple, SpaceX, and the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's a bit of a mouthful, TSMC. So Apple has been moving its supply chains out of China to other countries like India and Vietnam. And they've also moved their iPhone production just to places like Brazil. And so, for instance, India's exports of iPhones increased 33%. And iPhones are now India's top export to the United States. So that's a huge supply chain that's moving away from China to diversify that risk in case of a US-China trade war. And I mentioned SpaceX before. SpaceX has reportedly asked its Taiwanese suppliers to move production out of Taiwan. And there are other companies that are looking to move out of Taiwan as well to de-risk from some sort of potential future conflict. So I think one of the most interesting things that we should be thinking about is what businesses are doing. Sometimes governments don't predict how markets are moving, but if businesses start to move, then I think people should be more aware of increasing geopolitical competition and what might happen in the future. Okay, let's talk about intensifying great power competition. Mike, I want to ask you about this and whether or not we're in this new Cold War, or what type of environment would you classify that we're in 2025 in terms of competition between not just the US and China, but other countries, Russia, countries in Europe, also our own region like Japan, Korea, India. What type of multipolar world are we going into?
So this geopolitical competition, whether we call it a Cold War or not, it certainly has aspects that are very Cold War-like, but there are also differences. But this geopolitical competition among the major powers is another trend that's probably going to accelerate in 2025. When the Cold War ended, George Herbert Walker Bush, in the White House National Security Strategy, argued that we had a new opportunity to build a new world order where we cooperate with the former Soviet Union and China, and that we have more that we need to do together than we have that divides us. Bill Clinton put that in his national security strategy. I wrote parts of George W. Bush's national security strategy after 9/11, which said that cooperation on issues like counterterrorism would mean that big powers like the US and China and Russia have to work together. And Obama's national security strategy said the same thing. His issue was climate change. So for four presidents after the Cold War all believed and put in their national security strategies, and our policy was predicated on the idea that we could build cooperation around issues of common interests. And we had big differences. We needed allies, we needed deterrence, but that we could start to grow the areas of cooperation. When Donald Trump became president, his national security strategy in 2017 said, nope, the characteristic that is most salient now is great power rivalry. And there was kind of a sort of gasp from the foreign policy community, and then nobody really...
Because you said the quiet part out loud.
He said the quiet part out loud, to quote Homer Simpson. That was basically the same predicate for Joe Biden's national security strategy. Biden wrapped it in different words. His national security advisor said, we want competition without catastrophe. But that is now the underlying assumption. And I think it is fair to say, if you've read the Defense Strategic Review in Australia, or the Japanese national security strategy that came out in 2022, this is actually the operating assumption for a lot of countries, including perhaps especially China and Russia. When I was in the White House, we had pretty good relations with China, actually, not so bad. We could list our differences, and of course it included Taiwan, human rights, and so forth. But we had a list that was maybe half as long, but decent, where we needed to work together: North Korea, Myanmar, climate change, terrorism, and so forth. I asked the person who had my job in the Biden administration after they left, what was that list like for you guys? And this person said, the list where we cooperate is almost imperceptible. And so there is a zero-sum approach from Beijing, from Washington, and from other countries since the Ukraine war, where the list of where we cooperate is really small. The Biden administration wanted to do some things and never got much traction. So is it a Cold War in the sense that it's increasingly zero-sum, like there is no win-win? Yeah, that feels a bit like the Cold War. The alignment of China with Russia and with North Korea and Iran in the mix is pretty striking. North Korean troops fighting against the NATO-backed Ukrainian army, that's pretty striking. The historian Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins SAIS has argued that the level of cooperation between China and Russia today is actually greater than the cooperation between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, when you add up the technology, the economics, and things like that. So that is paralleled, of course, by the Quad, by US, Japan, Australia, AUKUS. So that does feel like the Cold War, but there are some very, very important differences. US trade with the Soviet Union never hit 1% of all US trade during the Cold War. Today, trade with China is below what it was, but still 7% of US trade overall. And of course, above 30% for Australia, over 20% for Japan and Germany. So the level of economic interdependence is quite different. And although problems like Taiwan, the Philippines with Second Thomas Shoal are getting more intense, the Chinese last year, at the end of the year, had the largest military exercise around Taiwan ever. Nevertheless, we don't want people to come out of here too depressed. There is economic interdependence that does matter. Deterrence matters. Military force against Taiwan would be potentially existential for China. And I'm not just talking about the nuclear weapons dimension, but defeat could be the end of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's a pretty powerful thing. And there is some moderation imposed on the US. The US, to compete, does not have the same level of power it had during the Cold War in relative terms. So for military posture, for technology, for diplomacy, the US relies more than it used to on Australia, on Japan in particular, which means those allies have a lot of say in what the US strategy is. Of course, the flip side is true, I would argue, as well. Japan, Australia, Korea are more dependent on the US than they ever were. It cuts both ways. But what it means is there are more voices around the table in real time dealing with these crises. So that's a bit of a moderating effect. But it is going to be a year, 2025. Donald Trump would love to have a big summit with Xi Jinping or Putin and declare world peace. Problem is, if you read the literature, the Chinese don't believe it, the Russians don't believe it. So I think we're probably also heading towards not war, but a heightened level of geopolitical rivalry and tension that is unlikely to diminish in 2025.
So what you just said then has sparked a question for me, which is this unusual contradiction between, on the one hand, President Trump talking about tariffs and basically having a sort of bravado around shirt fronting, dare I use that word, world leaders. But on the other hand, I've heard this argument that because President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize, that President Trump would also like that prize. Is that why you say he would love to be around the table with Putin and Xi to declare world peace?
So President Trump, according to the New York Times, in his business career, had said something like 4,000 lawsuits. 4,000 lawsuits, which means every interaction with Donald Trump is immediately litigious, tough, unpleasant. He really rose to fame most of all for his reality TV show. Yeah. So he's a master of and that's how he won the election, in my view, a master of dominating the news cycle, sucking all the attention. So there's a lot of drama. But if you look back at his previous administration, all of that drama with China, with Russia, with North Korea, didn't actually produce very much. Didn't produce very much. So
good for ratings, though.
Yeah. Now, he is less attached to allies. There's no question. Less attached to allies than any American president in the post-war period. The flip side of that is his national security team, people like Marco Rubio and others, are kind of traditional Republican hawks and know that we need allies. So there's going to be a lot of drama inside Washington, and it will all leak. And you can see it this week, where President Trump has a certain kind of, let's go for a big dramatic summit with Putin, or let's beat up Canada, our close ally. And then his own administration and Congress kind of walks it back and tries to control it. I think you're going to see a fair amount of that. I'm personally skeptical, and I have good reason to believe that Beijing is skeptical that he is going to produce some grand bargain with China or Russia or North Korea.
Let's move on to the next theme, which is a disruptive new technologies. I think whenever you're doing a trends event or what's happening in the future, you can't not have a conversation about technology. I wanted to actually kick off because of something you said, which is that allies will be influential and they'll work more with one another, like Australia working with Japan, for instance, and on this issue of technology. So for an Australian audience, we might see a lot of debates and geopolitical competition around technology, but often feel like we are just a sort of bystander or a recipient of that because Australia doesn't produce companies like ChatGPT or Google or an Apple. We are a sort of tech taker rather than a tech maker, so to speak. And therefore, we come at technology and new technologies like AI or quantum or other things like biotechnology with a totally different perspective than a country that actually makes that technology. So from an Australian perspective, when we're thinking about AI or other technologies, we're often thinking about regulating. We're often thinking about world-leading things like when this government decided to ban social media for children under 16. And it's interesting to see Australia leading in some areas. For instance, back in 2018, we were the first country in the world to ban high-risk vendors, being Chinese vendors like Huawei, from providing the backbone to our 5G technology. We were the first country to do that, and then other countries then followed. So I see Australia really forging its own path in a lot of different advanced and new technologies. And that actually gives us agency with other countries in the region to say, hey, if you don't agree with how technology is being used in your country, you can do something different from the United States too. But obviously, we also are feeling the impact of a lot of the technology competition. You might have seen that there was a TikTok ban in the United States that President Trump was able to put a halt to. And that is whether or not the Chinese owner of TikTok ByteDance can divest its interest and sell to somebody else. Who knows whether or not that will happen. But also there are big differences between Australia and the US in technology in terms of driverless cars and Chinese and Russian technology in cars. So for instance, in the United States, they are working towards banning Chinese and Russian technologies in cars by 2027. Australia is not thinking about doing that right now. Instead, we're thinking about de-risking certain parts of technology supply chains rather than complete bans. So we are really trying to have a sort of more calculated and I'd say a lighter touch approach than the United States. But look, Mike, would you like to give your perspective on new technologies, AI and that kind of thing? I mean, we had Donald Trump's big AI announcement in terms of investment, but what are you seeing in terms of technology trends in the US or globally?
Well, my major was history and political science, so I'm not really a technologist, but drawing on the history degree, technology transformations have the potential to accelerate the risk of geopolitics. The best example is railroads. And the railroad was invented in the 1820s, but by 1912, railroad networks were so sophisticated in Europe that they could move the entire German army from the east to the west. And so the whole German plan was to quickly defeat France before France could mobilize its railroads and get its. So if you've read The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, a lot of the acceleration into war in 1914, not all of it, but a lot of it was railroads and who could mobilize fastest. So AI, it's of course not brand new. If you bought a Japanese dishwasher in the 1990s, they called it fuzzy logic. And information technology goes back even further. But what's new is that AI has the ability to exponentially change advantage on the battlefield, which is partly why tech decoupling with China is happening so quickly. And it has the potential, AI, to blind you. So we understand how deterrence works now in the nuclear realm. But what if a combination of AI and cyber blinds American satellites in a conflict? And so the US doesn't know whether nuclear missiles are being launched. Or what if China or Russia completely take humans out of the decision-making loop for the use of force? The NATO, the US, Australia, other democracies have all agreed that we will not take the human out of any decision to use force. China and Russia haven't agreed. And if that's not scary enough, some of you probably saw this survey of almost 3,000 AI experts around the world, and a majority of them said, go home and open your single malt whiskey after this. A majority of them said there's a 5% chance that AI will learn how to destroy humanity to save itself. There's a cheery thought. And then bio. A lot of terrorism experts are worried that OpenAI will allow relatively untrained terrorists or lone actors to develop pathogens So there's a lot of scary stuff about AI, but you don't see it on the battlefield in Ukraine, really. You don't see it yet. It hasn't happened. And there still is a chance to set norms and controls, perhaps. And Australia should be a big part of that. You're right, Hayley. I think a lot of the debate in Australia has been about AI in terms of consumer safety and not thinking about Australia's role in defining the global rules that govern AI. I thought the Prime Minister's answer to the question on DeepSeek the other day did not give me the feeling that cabinet here is having deep, long discussions about the future of AI.
Oh, I didn't see that. What did he say?
Not much.
Okay.
And not to name him, that's a government issue. So you and I know people who are in DISA and defense and DFAT and ONI and other parts of government and state governments thinking about this, but Australia is kind of a technology taker in this space, but because of Australia's standing internationally, regionally, and with the US and Five Eyes, Australia could be a real shaper of what emerges. And we at the center, we're hoping to do more on this. We have invited a number of leading thinkers on AI policy from the US and Japan, and we'll let you know, because Australia should be at the front of that debate.
Yeah. Just on the DeepSeek AI model that China was able to come up with, apparently it was produced 20 times cheaper than American models like ChatGPT. So where American models cost up to $1 billion, China can make it for 100 million or something like that.
We'll see. It's interesting because some of the latest analysis suggests they did it cheaper because we paid for it. And that's one of the challenges of AI. It's like, unlike other technologies, if you develop it with billions and billions of dollars, it's compared to, say, like making jet fighters or satellites, it's a lot easier for somebody else if they've got the industrial capacity to then quickly catch up by learning from what you did, which is why investors are wondering if they should invest in it, but they will.
Well, the other thing, very interesting thing about that is China did use some now banned NVIDIA chips to make this DeepSeek, but it also used older chips. And so you can see that the US-China technology competition, which has seen the US put its Chips and Science Act into practice, which basically starves China of access to these advanced semiconductor chips, is breeding its own innovation because scientists of China are just finding ways to use older technology to make a really, really cheap application, which gives me pause for thought because that's also how you see other competition like the moon race or the race for the nuclear bomb. This kind of strategic competition is creating a lot of new innovations, and hopefully they'll be for mankind's benefit this time around. Let's talk about the final two before we open it up to questions. I might deal with risks to social cohesion. And then, Mike, you might want to do disruptors, rogues, and spoilers because you've actually been to North Korea a couple of times. So I'll just be pretty quick on the social cohesion trend. The reason why I put this on the list is because I personally feel like there are some challenges to social cohesion in wealthy democratic countries like Australia. I think this trend started quite a long way back, so it hasn't just emerged. But I feel like it got turbocharged after COVID and after inflation increased. And there was a general sense among the public that perhaps their children would be worse off than they are because of the cost of living and the fact that there is less trust in democratic institutions. So you see that in a number of ways. One of the ways you see it from a geopolitical lens is there is some backlash to globalization. There's backlash to groups like the United Nations, to the World Trade Organization, to the World Health Organization, which the United States has just tried to get out of. And so you see not only publics, but also their elected representatives walking back from some of these global institutions that are all meant to help us cooperate. I think that's a big risk. You also see the formation of much smaller groupings. So Mike mentioned before the Quad, Australia, US, Japan, India. There's lots of other minilateral groups that have sprung up in response to frustration around large multilateral organizations not delivering what they're supposed to deliver. And then at a more local level, if you look at the United States, I think that there is lacking social cohesion because there's more political polarization, because you go back to the cost of living and you go back to the fact that The economy is shifting away from fossil fuels to clean energy. Those people in Rust Belt communities are frustrated that they lost their job and that they have to retrain. A lot of people don't want to retrain and don't have the skills that they need for the new economy of the future. So I think there is a lot of social tensions. There's an undercurrent of frustrations within publics about the democratically elected governments, and it's creating more polarization. I think in Australia, we're very lucky. We're not as polarized as some other countries, but a lot of surveys do find, like OECD surveys, Pew surveys, that there is less trust in government. In fact, in the US, trust in the US government in 2023 was a record low. 16% of respondents said they trust their government to do what's right. So that's a pretty low figure. All right, let's look at the last one, and then we'll get to your questions. So rogues, disruptors, spoilers. Mike, they have been around for a long time. What makes them important in 2025?
Yeah, let me just do a quick. You captured the social cohesion challenges well, and they're in Australia too, despite the the fact that Australia has much less polarized politics than the U.S. or Korea or a lot of democracies. I'm a little bit of a glass half full guy on this. More people voted last year than ever in human history. Despite the frustration with democracy, global surveys show that overwhelmingly people think democracy, as Winston Churchill said, it's the worst form of government except all the other ones. And Americans are wealthier. A lot of studies show Americans are wealthier, and it's not, there is the gap between rich and poor is growing, but a lot of that is not that the people are getting poorer. Poverty has been decreasing the last 2 years. It's a lot more complicated. And I think social media, I have 2 teenage kids who would rather fish and read than get on social media. So let's face it, professors' kids are just weird. But a lot of the other parents I talk to, and some of you are probably in this boat, worry a lot. And if you're a professor or an educator, you worry because what you assign in class is shorter and shorter and shorter because this generation is not willing to read as much. And we have, social media is great, like WhatsApp groups with your friends from uni, creating, crowdsourcing to find people who've gotten lost in the jungles of the Amazon. There's just amazing things, but it also creates, as you say, these communities that can sort of wallow in resentment towards other communities. And you can see that in Australia too, frankly. So but to me, I'm a bit technology neutral on this one. I think there's some humane, decent, good things that come out of it. And there's some very worrisome things. And a lot of it comes down to leadership. I think we are not producing anywhere the quality of leaders we need to build a new social compact. And I also worry about Russia, China, and others trying to, take advantage of this, which Russia clearly is doing, and you see China doing it in parts of the world. Right, the rogue, the bad guys, the ones we forget about. Oh yeah, North Korea. You're
probably the only person in this room who's been to North Korea.
Has anyone been to North Korea? Are you DFAT? Journalist. Oh, you did the Koryo Air. Oh yeah, and you got back. See, I flew U.S. Air Force Air. So although when we flew out of
safer, I wonder.
Well, I will say when we flew out of Pyongyang after very tense negotiations with the North Koreans, the pilot got on, and normally the pilot says, like, we're turning off the seatbelt sign. He said, we're out of surface-to-air missile range, and everyone cheered. We're not, it's funny, in Australia, you don't read or hear a lot about some of these bad actors. In North Korea, Australia is in the UN command and has officers. I remember taking President Bush into the UN command and the bunker to get the briefing from the military leaders about the North Korea threat. And the intelligence general who briefed President Bush was Australian. Australia is in the UN command. If something happens in the Korean Peninsula, Australia has committed to respond. So that's not nothing. Of course, there have been North Korean incidents in Australia with drug running and so forth. North Korea is developing a more dangerous arsenal. It has not tested nuclear weapons in some time, but it has continued to develop more lethal and capable missiles and in all likelihood, nuclear weapons. It has nuclear weapons, but they're getting more lethal. We don't know what Russia gave North Korea in exchange for weapons and troops, but it wasn't good. And we also know North Korea is exploiting the geopolitical tension. So it used to be that when North Korea launched a ballistic missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or violated UN Security Council resolutions or tested a nuclear weapon, most of all, we could count actually on China and Russia in the Security Council to do something with us. Not what we wanted, but to put, not now, completely broken. So that's kind of a green light for North Korea in some ways. Maybe not for war, maybe not for a nuclear test, but to keep doing what it's doing. There's very little pressure on them now from China, and Russia is actually enabling. Iran is a constant challenge. I think people should be focused more on Iran. Whatever you think of Gaza, one thing is very clear, which is Bibi Netanyahu has put Iran on his back foot. Hamas, of course, but Hezbollah and the Houthis, and then basically destroyed Iran's air defense to show them what they could do. So Iran is on its back foot. Does that mean Iran behaves? No, not necessarily. Iran now may be looking for asymmetrical sort of demonstrations that it is big, bad, and mean, which is not good. And then you have a group of dysfunctional and dangerous states in this region, Myanmar, which has a potential to export all kinds of trouble to China, to Southeast Asia, and everywhere. And Afghanistan, Yemen, these are countries where radical terrorists will take root. And so we shouldn't have ended on this one. It's not the dog that didn't bark, but it could. It could. And these rogue states are not likely to be the cause of a general war among the great powers, but they can cause a great deal of instability and uncertainty. We don't know what they'll do in 2025, but the geopolitical tensions mean that Russia, China, the US, Japan, Britain are not working together at all on these problems, which gives them a lot more leeway to cause trouble. So can we end on a happy note? Maybe we'll get a question.
The audience, yeah.
The audience will, yeah.
Okay, well, now is the time for audience questions. And we have people watching online as well. So if you do have a questions, please wait till you get the microphone. But what do you think about the geopolitical trends we talked about? So I really invite you to engage with us and let us know what you think. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, this gentleman up here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments. My question has to do with the road category. But first, I'd like to thank Dr. Green for continuing a podcast that you've been doing from Washington, the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is an excellent podcast, and I'm glad.
Did not pay him. We have not met.
Never met before, but I would like to thank you.
It's called the Asia Chessboard. You can find it on our website. It's between USSC and CSIS, and it's Geopolitics of Asia. Yeah.
Sorry, we better check that mic. I don't think it's working. There we go.
My question is, in Foreign Affairs last month, there was a fairly persuasive article to the effect that South Korea should obtain nuclear weapons. That's been a rumbling topic in South Korea. It's a relevant topic for Japan also. Are we on the threshold of a chain reaction of further nuclear proliferation?
So much for the good news. Questions from the audience. Do you want to do them one at a time?
Would you like to take?
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. That one merits.
Yeah, one at a time.
Yeah. So the South Koreans have the technology to develop nuclear weapons within a year or two. The Japanese probably in less than a year. Australia probably in less than 2 years. If the world really went to hell in a handbasket, if you could not count on US extended deterrence, the so-called nuclear umbrella, and you had a rogue North Korea with nuclear weapons, you had China being more belligerent, then it might make sense in that world for South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. If South Korea did, it might make sense for Japan. And then, I was at MIT about 15 years ago, and we played out a game what this world would look like. And I won't say who it was, but a very prominent Australian academic led the Australian team, watched all this, and in that game, Australia finally developed nuclear weapons. However, the cost of developing nuclear weapons for South Korea or Japan is extremely high. South Korea would be expelled from the nuclear suppliers group, so it couldn't get the technology. The US would end the peaceful nuclear cooperation agreement, so it couldn't get technology from the US. The diplomatic hit to South Korea with its key trading partners would be massive. And perhaps most of all, it would be putting at risk the US nuclear umbrella. So very, 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 very high cost. South Korea is a democracy, and there's no cost to political leaders musing about nuclear weapons to show South Korea is equal to North Korea and better than Japan. There's no real cost. So that's why you hear it a lot, in my view. In Japan, 80% of the public consistently says they don't want nuclear weapons, even if, the world goes to hell in a handbasket. The Hiroshima Nagasaki legacy is quite powerful. Bottom line is, you could make a scenario to nuclear weapons, but at every stage, the US in particular, but also Australia and other allies, have the tools to reassure and prevent that from happening. And the US in general has been very responsive when South Korea or Japan or Australia start getting nervous about whether we're credible, which is a longer conversation. So I'm not overly worried about it, but if we're complacent, we could be surprised. So it does require, we're doing work on this, and the government in Canberra is actually increasingly interested in this question and what agency Australia has in non-proliferation efforts, in alliance relations with the US, and in relations with Japan and Korea, what Australia can do. And our answer is actually quite a bit. So we're in a world where the US can't do this alone for sure.
Yes.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights. It's very interesting. I know, Dr. Green, that you said you remarked on how last year was a big year of elections and record number of people around the world voted. And I think that many commentators have noted that incumbents in that situation have done poorly. Do you see that as part of a bigger trend? Is that going to impact in elections coming forward? And does it relate to any of the big trends that you see coming forward in this year?
Yeah, I think the meta theme for elections in 2024 and 25 is the cost of living. And so, and I'm sure Peter Dutton's thinking that too. And you've seen the polling here change. I wonder if inflation will go down fast enough to make a difference. Australia's got compulsory voting, and that's a bit more of a, what's the word, cushion against a big swing like you would see in the US or Japan. Japan, you had a huge loss for the government, 55% voter turnout. US was about 65%. But with compulsory voting, I think that probably is more of a buffer. But nevertheless, I personally have no doubt that cost of living is going to be a major, major driver and make this a very close election. When normally in Australia, as I understand it, the incumbent gets a little time to get their job done. Not so much in the current environment. The other question you asked about the geopolitics, definitely a factor. I think people sense, and it's not because people like me and Hayley are up here saying it, people sense that there's more entropy, more disorder in the world. And they want leaders who can try to stabilize things and reassure them. And I would give Joe Biden pretty high marks on his foreign policy towards Asia, for example. But a lot of the American public thinks, that they see all this chaos and they blame the guy behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. And to some extent, that may be true for Australia or Japan or other countries. There's another debate about whether this is a shift from the left to the right. That's not as clear. Conservative commentators will say, of course it is. But, the Tories were voted out in the UK. So that one's more of a debate. There is, in the US, the whole DEI, woke, all that culture war stuff, that was not why Donald Trump won the election. But there is an argument that, and the Democrats, many of them make this, that they probably focus too much on those issues. And the problem with that is people wanted to know what they do about the cost of living. So it's sort of like, that's all fine, but what are you doing about? So I suspect you'll see a lot of that percolating in the Australian election, but because of compulsory voting. which by the way, Americans will never do, you got a bit more of a buffer against these global trends, but not a complete buffer. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think incumbency was the main factor that was bad for governments in their elections, in the 73 elections that were had last year. Last time Australia had a one-term government, though, was the 1930s. So it would be almost 100 years since we've seen only a one-term government. If there is a change of government in April, who knows when the election will be. Other questions? Let's go all the way over there, because I always feel sorry for the people who are on the edges. They all
back to
ignored.
My question is more about the relations between Elon Musk and Donald Trump and how that's going to work out, particularly looking at Trump's attitude towards China and also in how dependent Tesla is on China, and also sort of more about Trump's anti-climate change stance, which is goes against the whole narrative of EVs as an importance for the economy or trying to stop climate change. Yeah.
Well, somebody ought to start a pool, like a bet on when Donald Trump and Elon Musk explode
Their
like
bromance
nitroglycerin
goes.
and the bromance ends, because the clock's ticking in my view. Musk has a different view of China. He has a different view of EVs and climate, at least in terms of his Tesla business. He's driving the core Trump political staff crazy, as you probably saw when Donald Trump brought these tech titans together and announced this $500 billion national campaign to invest in AI. Elon Musk tweeted on X, trolled on X, saying, no, those guys have the money. Like, I worked in the White House. That would really piss me off. That would make me mad if so the staff is increasingly going to be telling President Trump, this guy's nothing but trouble. Some of Elon Musk's ideas, in this flurry of executive orders and shock and awe, 90% of which will be gone pretty soon. One of the things they did was send an email out to federal workers. U.S. federal workforce is huge, millions of people, saying if you take early retirement, we'll pay you, was it 6 months or 9 months salary? That was completely Elon Musk. That's what he tried to do at X. Problem is the U.S. Congress hasn't authorized or budgeted that money, so it's not there. So Democrats said, hold on, don't take this deal, because that money may never show up in the budget. So that was Elon Musk. So the stuff that worked for Tesla, not working in the U.S. government, the friction with the White House staff, the different interests. Sooner or later, I figure that's gotta have an impact on their relationship. And is there somebody like that who Donald Trump was friends with a few years ago, who he's still friends with? I can't think of anybody. So we should start a pool. Maybe we can raise money around it. Is that probably illegal?
And just on your point too, on clean energy, I've been speaking with businesses in the United States, and a lot of Republican states were beneficiaries of Biden era subsidies for electric vehicles. Unbelievably, one of the states that has the most renewable energy is Texas. And a lot of companies, I'll ask them, are you worried that Donald Trump has issued an executive order saying that he's taking money away, or at least halting money disbursements for EV charging stations? And they'll say, no, we're working with other customers, and they're the ones that are driving the demand for EVs. So even though on the campaign trail, Donald Trump might have, talked up how climate change is a hoax, and he talked about how wind turbines were causing cancer, and he said how much he hated EVs, people will vote with their wallets, and that's what companies respond to.
It's a really good point. The U.S. is such a big, complicated country. Like, emission standards in the U.S. historically have basically been set by the state of California, because that market is so big that if you're Volkswagen or Mazda, you're not going to, you're going to follow that. Whatever North Dakota or South Carolina says is just not going to make the same impact. So a lot of stuff is going to be now at the state level. But Donald Trump's all about drama and shock and awe, and Washington is absolutely dizzy from this first week and a half of executive orders and commands and edicts. It's possible we're seeing peak Trump power. Possible that this is sort of, he's striking because he knows he's got this opening now.
This gentleman here.
Thanks firstly to both of you. What a great conversation this is. Dr. Green, the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, recently said, I quote, that the post-war global order is not just obsolete. It's been used as a weapon against us. What do you think he meant by that? And related to that, does, in your view, the international rules-based order exist today?
It's a really interesting question. I've met Marco Rubio a number of times. You know, he's the son of Cuban immigrants in Florida, and that means anti-communist. And he is taking that worldview and looking at China through that lens, which, by the way, is how in polls most Americans and a majority of Australians, by the way, are looking at China's future. And that sort of criticism of the international liberal order, that also, you know, it's music to the Trump White House ears too. So taken together, I think Rubio is going to be a pretty good Secretary of State for Australia, a very good Secretary of State for Australia. He's very pro-allies. He'll listen to Penny Wong. He already has. You know, his first big meeting was with the Quad foreign ministers. So far, the staff that have been appointed, my old job in the White House as the senior Asia advisor and so forth, have been pretty good. And we know a lot of them, and they spend a lot of time on Australia and Japan and Korea. But there's going to be a much larger debate in Washington about how much of the rules-based order we should keep. Most constituencies, whether it's farmers or business or state governments or universities, even labor unions, most constituencies want predictability. They don't want the world-based order to go away. There are aspects they're very unhappy about. The World Trade Organization is not very popular right now because the feeling is, it doesn't help us. The WHO is not popular, but that's a very partisan niche issue. I think what for Australia, and we've been advising this to our friends in Canberra, it would be a mistake to go to this new administration and preach the virtues of the international liberal order. It's a little bit like going to a lapsed Catholic, and talking about how awesome confession is or something. I hope I haven't stepped over a line there. It's going to take a sort of back to fundamentals. What are our national interests? What are the threats? What do our businesses need? And then go in and think, so how do we reform the system? That's the Australian approach, the Japanese approach. And by the way, I'm convinced Japan and Australia will have more influence on this than any countries. Britain normally would, but Britain's in a bit of political transition right now. And this is an administration, frankly, and Marco Rubio and the Secretary of Defense Hegseth said this in their testimony, that's focused on the Indo-Pacific. But the key is talk about, well, what is it we're trying to achieve? So even the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is quite unpopular in Washington now, I think a case could be made for what it does for the US as well. But that's the kind of discussion. There's not a consensus at all in the US that we need to break the system. And there's a bit of intellectual paralysis in Washington on this question. So I think it's an opportunity. And more than an opportunity, I pray that close friends like Australia and Japan will weigh in. So there'll be a lot of people in the US system who will say thank you.
So unfortunately, we are at time. I think what we've taken away from tonight is that 2025 is going to be a big year for geopolitics. It's always a big year for the US Studies Center, but I think after a year of elections last year, there was a lot of change, and change can be good or it can be bad. But one thing that change does is it creates a lot more risk and uncertainty. And so I think that we're going to see a lot more questions from publics to their leaders, a lot more dynamic interactions between countries on the global stage. And if you are interested in learning more about this, Mike and I have done a geopolitics and business sprint course. You can enroll and do it online in your own time. It will tell you every single thing you need to know about what's changing in the world today and about what you can do to prepare for it. So it's not just this is happening at you, it's and this is what you do about it next. And I think that's something that will be increasingly important because as an Australian myself, a lot of the news and analysis that I receive is kind of like reporting, but it's not a so what or what next or how am I empowered to do something about these changes that are affecting me, the people around me, and the companies that I work for. So with that, I wanted to thank you, the audience, for coming, showing your enthusiasm on a rainy evening. I really want to thank our organisers for their help, Janine, Becky, and Shizuka, and others. Thank our online audience, and please join us for our next event. We will be having a lot of events throughout the year to help explain the Trump administration and what's happening in the world. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Hayley.